Citroën is known for its innovation, and Renault is often overlooked. But it was Renault in the 1960s that pioneered hatchback designs, and it was Renault that put it all together into one of the first small hatchbacks, the Renault 5. It struck a chord with customers. It was sold as the cheeky Le Car in North America and went on to become the best-selling car in France for most of the 1970s and 80s. How did this stylish hatchback come about? Why did the second generation look so similar to the first? And what's next? This is the Renault 5 story. Renault were no strangers to small practical cars. They produced the Renault 4 in 1961, which was a reaction to the Citroën 2CV. The Renault 16 in 1965 showed how a hatchback design could reconfigure the car to become something truly practical for everyday use. Renault brought this hatchback practicality to the Renault 4 with a reskin that they called the Renault 6 in 1968. A year earlier, Renault's boss, Pierre Dreyfus, challenged the design team to make a next-level small car, a voiture à vivre, or a car for all seasons. It should be a small and nimble second car to be used around town, but be able to carry a family of 4 the length of France in comfort on one of those new fancy auto routes. It should take the practicality from the Renault 16 and should be something that the utilitarian Renault 4 and 6 weren't: stylish. In short, it needed to be a new leap forward as Renault moved into the 1970s. The shape came from Michel Bouet, who was doodling new car shapes to fit on the Renault 4 platform, and hit upon something better than the Renault 6's boxy look. Renault management loved the shape, a development team was formed, and they got to work. Small hatchbacks weren't yet a thing. That would come with the Italian Autobianchi A112 in 1969 and would be popularised by the Fiat 127 2 years later. In fact, all 3 companies were, in parallel and unbeknownst to each other, creating a blueprint for the modern small hatchback. Renault's car was longer than both of them and was aimed at competing with Citroën's Ami and New Diane, both based on the long-lived Citroën 2CV. Renault also toyed with other shapes for their new car, a saloon for the Spanish market as well as a coupe and an estate, possibly to replace the Renault 4. But Renault's designers focused on the hatchback, and it went from a sketch to final design in just 2 years, a remarkably short period. Renault's experience with hatchbacks meant that the rigid body could support an open roof that would feature a large canvas sunroof. Something of a first, the boot didn't have a lip to get over, making it easier to get things into the back. The team went for a minimal grille and square headlights that, along with plastic bumpers, made for a modern, welcoming look. It was light years ahead of the competition. Those new plastic bumpers were an innovation, but were a hard sell to management as they cost more than traditional metal bumpers. But unlike metal bumpers, they could withstand impacts of up to 4 miles an hour, and there were fewer parts, which reduced assembly costs. A bold decision was to make it a 3-door car. Most French cars, even the minimalist Citroën 2CV, had doors for the rear passengers. Marketing people weren't sure that French people were quite ready to do the back seat squeeze. The designers created a 5-door version, but a 3-door with its hidden door handles were less to produce, and in any case, the hatchback made for easy rear access. But the main factor was a nascent joint venture between Renault and Peugeot. To reduce competition between the 2 companies, they agreed that Renault's car would only have 3 doors, while Peugeot agreed that their next small car wouldn't be a hatchback, at least not initially. The Renault 5 might seem revolutionary, but underneath, much of it had been borrowed from the 8-year-old Renault 4. It's no accident that both cars used almost the same wheelbase, and they used the same mechanicals and engines. But the modern monocoque body was built with the latest equipment. Renault took delivery of their first robot for Renault 5 production to automatically weld the body together. Like with the exterior, the interior used modern touches such as coloured lights for the dashboard. Like the Renault 4, the gear stick grew out of the dashboard. The controls and instruments were designed to minimise driver distraction, something new and innovative. The deforming padded dashboard, front disc brakes, collapsible steering column and front crash structure were designed to reduce injuries before the age of the airbag. The ergonomically designed seats were comfortable enough for those long autoroute journeys, naturally in wild 1970s colours, and the rear seat could fold down for a level of practicality not seen on competitors' cars. But overall, this was a gamble for Renault. Would customers reject the hatchback as utilitarian? Would they be put off a car that didn't have rear doors? Their worries were mitigated a little when the Fiat 127 launched in 1971 and got a warm reception, but doubts remained. Was this, as Renault thought, the future of small cars? The new Renault 5, so named for its 5 fiscal taxable horsepower, was first shown in December of 1971, the perfect Christmas present. At a time when car adverts were banned from French TV, cinemas up and down the country hailed Renault's new practical supercar, and Renault also launched a large-scale print campaign. They played up the car's friendly rounded looks as well as the hatchback's practicality. To modern eyes, the Renault 5 doesn't look that special, but to customers in 1972, the new car was a breath of fresh air. It was an instant hit, appealing to all classes and age groups, and made the competition sit up and take notice. Even Peugeot's 104 that launched 9 months later didn't have the style of Renault's new car, even if it did have 5 doors. But the Peugeot 104, like the Renault 6, were cars for the head and not for the heart. By the end of the first year of production, over 120,000 Renault 5s had been sold. Right-hand drive models reached British shores later that year, and production started in Spain. The Spanish car would be the first to move the gear stick to the floor, something that would appear on most Renault 5s by 1973. The car's designer, Michel Bouet, who'd also designed those colourful interiors, tragically wouldn't see his car's success, dying just a few months after the car launched. Electric cars had fallen out of fashion at the turn of the 20th century, but car companies started experimenting with them again in the late 60s and early 70s. 10 Renault 5s were electrified with lead-acid batteries, the same batteries used in milk floats, and as you can imagine, performance and range weren't terrific. Like all these electrification experiments, it didn't move to production. As demand increased, Renault launched the new LS with a larger 1.3 litre engine and a few more mod cons. But by 1974, Renault had some direct competition in the form of Volkswagen's Golf, which was almost the same size, but crucially came with either 3 or 5 doors. Spain produced the booted Renault Siete, or 7 in Spanish, finally giving the car those rear doors it needed. To achieve this, the Renault 5 platform was stretched by 10 centimetres. The plastic bumpers were dropped for old-fashioned chrome-plated metal. The Siete sold modestly well in Spain, but elsewhere it made more sense to pay a little more for the larger Renault 12. As well as a saloon, Renault launched the Renault 5 Society van, a natural progression given how easy it was to load cargo. The LS luxury version turned into the TS with even more features such as a centre console, reversing lights and new front seats that looked like they'd come out of a 1970s science fiction TV show. And with a rush to fuel-efficient cars in the mid-70s, Renault launched the frugal GTL that included plastic side protection to go with the plastic front bumpers. Again, this doesn't stand out today, but was a revolution at the time. It wasn't all frugality at Renault though. In 1976 they introduced the Renault 5 Alpine, using their sporting brand to counteract the threat of the original hot hatch, the Simca 1100 Ti, and of course the recently launched Volkswagen Golf GTI. In the UK it was known as the Gordini, as Chrysler had first dibs on the Alpine name over there. Although the 1.4 litre Renault 5 Alpine got the car to 60 in less than 10 seconds and allowed the car to get over 100 miles an hour, it couldn't beat its German rival and was using improved but older suspension that had its roots in the 1961 Renault 4. But despite this, it would prove more than capable on the rally circuit, finishing second and third overall in the 1978 Monte Carlo Rally, an achievement that was commemorated with 2,400 special edition cars. Both the hatchback and saloon would take on the Honda Civic in Japan as the Renault Go, but Renault's main focus for exports would be North America, where it would once again face off against the Golf, rebadged there as the Volkswagen Rabbit.
Frisky, thrifty,
Renault.
Dauphine.
Here it is, America's largest selling four-door import, the Renault Dauphine.
Renault had been selling their cars in North America for many years and even outsold their German rival on occasion. Would Americans warm to Renault's contemporary Mini now that they were turning their back on gas guzzlers? To comply with US regulations, the engine was detuned for emissions and it got round headlights and larger bumpers. Renault flew the press to California on a specially chartered 747 to savour the finest French food and wine and to try their compact hatchback. All that champagne schmoozing seemed to have done the trick because reviews for the Renault 5 were largely positive. But the public didn't agree, maybe due to Renault's reputation for poor reliability. Initial sales didn't live up to expectations, so Renault quickly made changes to turn things around. The first was swapping to a new ad agency. The public didn't understand what the Renault 5 name was all about. Where were the Renaults 1, 2, 3 and 4? The new ad agency proposed calling it something different. Names like the Renault Frog were rejected and it was ultimately called Le Car. The second change was taking over the ailing American Motors Company, or AMC. This gave them access to AMC's 1,300 dealers across the country. Sales doubled, but with Detroit launching their own small hatchbacks, the North American market was always going to be an uphill battle. And Le Car struggled to gain Le traction, especially with more rust and breakdowns than the competition. However, it did well in French-speaking Canada as Le 5, taking half of the small car market. When the Renault 5 launched in 1972, the interior had been Spartan, but not out of the ordinary. Interior comfort and dashboard design moved on in the 1970s, and the Renault 5 tried to keep pace, but it was falling behind. So the 1979 facelift made an updated interior its main focus. The other major change was finally a 5-door model with real door handles. Along with an automatic gearbox that had appeared the previous year, this fleshed out the range, appealing to a wider audience. And it certainly seemed that Renault had made the right changes, as the Renault 5 had its best year yet in 1980, selling over 700,000 cars. It was the best-selling car in Europe, not bad for a light refresh of an 8-year-old design. The slow-selling Spanish Renault 7, now called the 7, didn't get much of an update. The largest change were new rear lights, a new 4-spoke steering wheel, and a barely noticeable change to the dashboard. In the 1970s, turbocharging moved from something only used in trucks to something you could shoehorn into a car, and Renault would prove their turbocharging prowess when they won the 1979 French Grand Prix, the first time a turbocharged car had ever won in Formula One. They started work on a turbocharged Renault 5 for rallying in 1977 with the help of coach builder Bertone. By 1978, they had something that was drivable with wide rear tyres to get all that extra power down, which required fat rear fenders. The power they produced from their mid-mounted 1.4 litre engine was quite remarkable. To compete in FIA rally events, Renault had to sell a certain amount of road-going versions, so the Renault 5 Turbo with its futuristic Bertone designed interior was put on sale to a few lucky punters in 1980. Its 158 horsepower 1.4 litre fuel-injected engine and lightweight body were a stupidly fast combination, going from a standstill to 60 in a blistering 6.5 seconds, almost unheard of at the time, and it would give cars like the Lotus Esprit a run for their money. With the Fuego launched at almost the same time, Renault could capitalise on its newfound Formula One success. The Renault 5 Turbo didn't just go quickly in a straight line though, it won the 1981 Monte Carlo Rally, beating out the new Audi Quattro. Those homologation specials sold well, but were expensive to produce and not that practical with a large engine sitting in the middle of the car. Renault produced something more consumer-friendly the following year, the Renault 5 Alpine Turbo with the turbocharged engine at the front. It wasn't quite the fire-breathing monster of the Renault 5 Turbo, but it was still a barrel of fun. It was also a lot more affordable at half the price. At the other end of the spectrum was the frugal GTL with fuel economy so good that, according to Renault, it was witchcraft. In reality, it was comparable to the competition though. And the 5 got a little more luxury. The TX model appeared with electric windows, power steering, a leather steering wheel, split rear seats, and a digital clock. But electric windows couldn't disguise the fact that the Renault 5 had been on the market for over 10 years. That was thrown into stark relief when Volkswagen updated the Golf in 1983 and French car company Peugeot introduced the 205. French customers rushed to buy the 205 hotness, sending Renault 5 sales plummeting. And the 205 wasn't just beating Renault in the showrooms, it would win the 1985 Monte Carlo Rally, making the Renault 5 Turbo look old hat. Renault threw out special editions and an updated and less expensive turbo model until they could launch their second generation car. Cost savings were found by using the interior from the Alpine Turbo and regular Renault 5 doors rather than the custom lightweight aluminium ones on the original car. It wasn't quite as fast, but it was still a force to be reckoned with. Le Car hadn't taken off in the USA and was replaced by the Renault 11 in 1983. It soldiered on in Canada until 1985. When a car manufacturer produces a next generation car, they sometimes keep bits of the previous version, the platform, engine, suspension, gearbox, etc. But almost always they update the shape to give the public something new and fashionable to yearn for. Renault decided to buck this trend. Much of the car was updated, the platform and the interior were taken from the straight-laced Renault 9 and 11, but the shape barely changed. It wasn't the fault of the stylist Marcello Gandini. Customer clinics told Renault that they didn't want a new Renault 5 shape. Each new design was roundly rejected, so Gandini dutifully copied the Renault 5's classic lines despite not enjoying the process, making it a little larger and more aerodynamic in the process. The car launched in 1984 as the Super 5 or Super 5. It was only available initially as a 3-door model, but customers could still get hold of a 5-door Renault 5 as the old model was still on sale at a budget price. The new car used the petrol engines from the old car along with a diesel from the Renault 9 and 11. The 5-door model appeared a year later, stretched 6 centimeters for more rear legroom. And what Renault 5 lineup wouldn't be complete without a sporty turbo? The Renault 5 GT Turbo followed the Renault 5 Alpine Turbo by putting the engine and turbo at the front of the car. A little more power and a little less weight helped, but it couldn't rival Renault's mid-engine monsters from the early 1980s. With turbo lag, some considered it a bit of a handful to drive. It managed to beat Peugeot's new 205 GTI in a drag race, but not their homologation special, the 205 Turbo 16. Despite, or maybe because of its visual similarity to the previous car, the new Renault Super 5 was a hit in its native France. Maybe French car buyers liked visual continuity. The Renault 4 was still on sale with very few changes since 1961, and the evergreen Citroën 2CV had been on roads for nearly 40 years at this point. The Super 5's success was a rare bright spot for Renault. The rest of their conservative range had sold poorly and reliability was dogging the company. All this was dragging on Renault's finances. But the new Renault 5 reclaimed the top spot in France in 1986, ousting the cool Peugeot 205, and would stay there for the rest of the 1980s. Production of the previous Renault 5 continued, and Renault struck on an even more cost-effective way to get customers into their cars. They bought old Renault 5s, reconditioned them, cut a hole in the roof, slapped on some wheel covers and stickers, and sold them as the Coach Special Edition. Renault removed the roof of their new model as well. Coach builder EBS created an open top, and the 1989 Belle Ile was a mashup between a convertible and a pickup. Renault had mostly used its Renault 4 platform to build its cheap and cheerful vans, but the 1985 Renault Express, also known as the Rapide or Extra, was based on the Renault 5. Some models included an innovative giraffe hatch to carry awkward long items. The Express Combi had a folding rear bench seat to turn it into a truly practical vehicle. The Express went on to be very successful in its home market, helping Renault's beleaguered finances as they strove to sell more vehicles using their existing tooling. The Super 5 got a super small update in 1987, but Renault's eyes were already on a replacement. This time they wouldn't copy the classic Renault 5 lines, but reach for something new. That would launch as the Renault Clio in 1990, and the Renault 5 would be sold as a budget model. But sales were strong enough that it continued in production until 1997, when Renault launched the Bye-Bye Special Edition. Almost 3.5 million second-generation cars had been produced, and the Express ended production in 2000 after selling over 1.7 million vans. During the Renault 5's life, it had been produced in many countries, and some continued production. Iran started producing the Siete Saloon in 1975 and moved on to make the first-generation Renault 5. After the Iranian Revolution, Iran was ostracized from the West, but they continued making these cars for the home market and also countries such as Algeria. So it was still being produced when the second generation ended production in Europe, and they continued producing it into the 2000s as the Frankenstein Saband PK with mechanicals from the Kia Pride and a Mazda engine. From 2006, a joint agreement with Renault resulted in new cars like the Megane coming to Iran, and the Renault 5 in all its Frankenstein glory ended production after 34 years. It's a little hard to correlate all the production figures, but it's safe to conclude that around 11 million Renault 5s or derivatives thereof were produced, and many have a nostalgia for the classic Renault 5 shape that has been seen for so long on French roads. Renault thought about bringing the 5 back in 2012. That didn't happen, but when Renault announced a Revolution in 2021, or Renaulution as they called it, they showed off a new Renault 5 EV concept. Well, recycling the shape had worked once before, so why not again? The new Renault 5 EV takes the story full circle, from the EV concept the year the Renault 5 launched to a new chapter for one of the first practical hatchbacks. It includes several classic Renault 5 cues, including the widened rear wheel arches of the Renault 5 Turbo, the charge port on the bonnet where the grille used to be, and the rear lights. Time will tell how close the production car comes to the vision, and if 21st century customers respond as enthusiastically as 20th century customers did. With such a popular shape that was a hit for so long, it's hard to see how it will fail. As Renault has worked on the design, they've expanded their vision with a Renault 5 Turbo 3E concept. It's clearly not designed for the road. That rear spoiler wouldn't do well in crash safety testing, but it's a sign that Renault feel that they can make an EV with some of the potency of the 1980s Renault 5 Turbo. With a claim 0 to 60 time of 3.5 seconds and playful touches like a free play button to start it, it looks like it could be a worthy successor to a car that is an institution in France. There's a lot said about other classic French cars such as the Citroën 2CV, but the Renault 5 has sold more in less time. It was a truly innovative, practical car that people took to their hearts and has stood the test of time. 20 years after the Renault 5, the Twingo was another stylish, popular car that captured the hearts of French car buyers. The video on the right talks about its history with Renault's head of design at the time, Patrick Lecouemont. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.